Hello everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible. Go ahead.
Okay, okay. So hello everyone. Thanks for joining with us here today during such turbulent times. This is Gagandeep Kaur and I'm going to be moderator for this session. I'm third year biology major student and currently at Project Encephalon. I'm serving in the capacity of Deputy Chief Human Resources Officer. As we continue with our third day of Cajal Week series, where we are paying a tribute and celebrating the spirit of Spanish neuroscientist Ramon y Cajal on his 169th birth anniversary, I would like to welcome Dr. Sean O'Donnell. Thank you so much, Dr. Sean O'Donnell, for joining with us here today. I'm personally very exhilarated for this talk, especially because of my interest in this intersection of ecology, evolution, and the brain circuitry. So I personally am very excited. Well, to tell a little bit about Dr. Sean, uh, he's a professor of biodiversity, earth and environmental science at Drexel University, USA. His neuroscience research focuses on how brain structure, plasticity, and evolution are affected by social behavior, basically mainly taking insect models. And he's also interested in tropical ecology and thermal physiology. He conducts field research and teaches field courses in Central and South America as well as in the Negev Desert in Israel. So I would like to welcome Professor Sean and thank you so much for joining with us here today. And yeah, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. I would say good morning, everybody, but I know that many of you are not experiencing morning right now, so good day to everybody. So I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen, right? Is that
Yes.
okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, has that come up properly?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So I'll start. So what I decided to do in this talk was walk everybody through what I think is a really exciting, relatively recent development in the field of neuroecology. So this is the field that tries to link the evolution and architecture of the nervous system to the ecological conditions that different species live in. And this particular manifestation of that hypothesis is called the social brain hypothesis. And we'll explore a little bit more in detail exactly what that means. So I want to start off by talking a bit about behavior and just make the really important point that if you don't study animal behavior, it's important to keep in mind that group living social behavior is actually quite rare in the animal kingdom. And I think it's easy for us as humans, as a very social species, to forget that fact. So as you're probably all aware, many species of primates live in obligate social groups. Turns out not quite all of them, but most species, but primates are unusual. So there are some other mammal examples of group living social species. Elephants are a great example of this, but sociality is quite rare overall among mammals. There are a small percentage of bird species that do this. And then, of course, it's well represented in insects. But again, the social insects are ecologically very successful. But in terms of their species diversity, they actually only represent a very small portion of species richness of insects. So social behavior is exceptional. And of course, we ourselves, as I already mentioned, are a great example of a social species. And I think a lot of our interest in studying the relationships of the nervous system with social behavior stem from trying to understand ourselves. And I think that we can learn a lot about the human condition by studying these other social species. And of course, I don't have to emphasize this too much speaking to this group. I'm assuming this is sort of preaching to the choir, but certainly when I give this kind of talk to a more general audience, I do think it's important to step back and assess whether focusing in specifically on brain investment and brain evolution is worthwhile. And so I'd just like to spend a little bit of time, talking about why we believe that brains are worthy of special attention. And I just want to note that this cartoon image that I've brought up here might be familiar to some of you, will come back to visit us a bit later on, and its relevance will become clear later in the talk. So are brains worthy of special attention? I would argue, of course, and hopefully you're all on board with this already, that the answer is yes. So one of the reasons that we believe that brains are worthy of special attention is that brain tissue is among the most expensive per gram in animals' bodies. And estimates of both the production, in other words, the developmental investment that goes into making a brain in the first place, and the maintenance costs of brains are both exceptionally high compared to other tissues. And if that's true, we then expect there to be very strong limits on the amount of tissue that's invested in brains and other sources, forms of investment, nutrients, etc. And I'm also going to argue that these very strong limits on central nervous system or brain investment should be particularly strong in flying animals because extra weight, for example, investing more in brain tissue comes at the cost of great energy expenditure when you're flying, and also effects on animals' body architecture, which we're going to explore in detail later on, can affect aerodynamics, and that may set very strong limits on brain investment as well. So I'd like to talk a bit about the field of neuroecology, which I already mentioned, and this is the framework that I'm conducting this research under. And the field of neuroecology can be described as the study of adaptive brain investment. However, we can explore neuroecological hypotheses and predictions at the level of individuals, so looking at brain plasticity, as well as at the level of comparing different species, in other words, looking at brain evolution. So I want to just walk through some of the underlying assumptions that we make when we're using neuroecological approaches to study the brain. So through this talk, what you're going to see as my response variables, we're going to be measuring the volume of central nervous system tissues. And in this talk, that's either going to be measures of whole brain size or the relative sizes of functionally distinct brain regions. So that's going to be our response variable. What we're assuming is that those volume differences that we measure reflect costly investment in tissue. In other words, particularly in the brain, and for reasons that we just discussed, we have good reason to expect this is true, you don't get something for nothing. In other words, if you're going to invest more in central nervous system tissue and brain tissue, that is going to necessarily have to come at the expense of the animal's capacity to invest in something else, whether that's competition among brain regions or competition between the brain and other tissues or other bodily functions is open to question. So the brain investment that we measure needs to reflect costly investment, and we are also going to assume that it's interesting. And what do I mean by that? It means that the volume changes or the volume variation that we measure needs to be somehow related to function. And what that generally means in terms of animal behavior is cognitive ability. And there are at least two different major kinds of changes in nervous system architecture that can link volume changes to cognitive ability. One is there can be variation in the numbers of units, the numbers of neurons in practice in most cases in the brain or in a brain region. And we can also see effects of changes in neuron connectivity. So the size and structural complexity and connectivity of individual neurons with each other can also influence volume. And that, of course, is also going to be related to cognitive ability or cognitive function. So what is some of the evidence that brains are special? In other words, why might we pick brains out among different organ systems and focus in on the brain in particular? I really love this diagram. I think this is fascinating work that is done by a Russian insect biologist, neurobiologist named Polovov. And this is a paper that he published in 2017. What we're looking at here is a survey across a wide array of different insect species, and they're spanning a very wide range of body sizes. So here on the x-axis is a log representation of body volume of these different insect species. So each data point here represents a single species. And against that, we're plotting the log of various organ system volumes. So we're looking at the allometric relationship, the shape relationship, if you will, between various organ systems and the total body. And you can see here that the slopes of these log-log relationships are very consistent across a wide range of organ systems: fat, body, and heart, musculature, digestive system, reproductive system, all show relatively similar slopes. And the brain stands out as being quite distinct. So I've represented the brain slope here in red. Brains have a unique body size allometry relationship. They have a shallower slope. So what this suggests is that at the low end, for smaller species, absolute brain size may be constrained not to fall below some minimum. And that suggests that there is a minimum amount of brain investment the species need to make to meet their cognitive needs. At the higher end, what may be pushing this slope down is that further brain investment is limited, perhaps by the high expenses that I talked about earlier. Okay, so one approach, as I mentioned, to studying neuroecology is the brain plasticity approach, or the individual differences approach. We might call this brain behavioral ecology. So what we're interested in testing here is whether individuals' brain investment matches the cognitive demands that the individual animals confront. And I'd like to show you some data from my lab. We did a test of this idea using army ants as our model system. And I think social insects bring a lot of really interesting variation in complexity in behavior and ecology to these questions about brain investment. So I'd like to play you a short video clip that illustrates some of the interesting behavioral features of army ants. And I'm going to argue that army ants are, in some senses, super societies. What I mean by that is that army ants are more integrated in many ways in their social behavior than even most other social insects. So what we can see here are workers stringing their bodies together to form a giant mass. This mass is the nest of the army ants. So the nest is made up of the interlinked bodies of the workers. And then from that nest pours out a stream of workers that move out into the forest and attack and butcher large-bodied insects. And they're able, by coordinating and cooperating, to take down very large-bodied prey that would not be accessible to them if they were working alone. So basically, the take-home message here is that army ants, probably more than any other kind of social insect, perhaps outstanding among all known societies on Earth, do everything in a coordinated, integrated way. There is little or no individual activity in an army ant society. The workers are always collaborating on different tasks. And along with this intense, massive collaboration that we've just seen, one of the really exciting features of army ant societies is that they develop, the workers develop into a wide range of what we call subcastes. So they are divided up into a range of different body sizes, and as you can see, body shapes. And it turns out that size and shape are reasonably good predictors of behavior of these individuals as well. In other words, the role that they play in the colony depends on their body structure. So let's first look at a worker. And this is just a partial list of some of the different behaviors that we could conceivably score a worker performing. Again, as we just looked at, they build the bivouac. They are capable of adjusting the bivouac's temperature. They move out from the colony and find and butcher food. They need to carry the food back to the colony and feed it to the larvae, the immatures, and care for those immatures. Then when the colony moves among different locations, they need to carry the larvae. They also need to attend the queen. And this is important, the workers are also responsible for feeding this other class of, as you can see, morphologically very specialized individuals. These are referred to as the soldiers. And the soldiers are larger and anatomically distinct and morphologically distinct. They have these large head capsules with these highly modified sickle-shaped mouth parts. And because of this weaponry on the front end, they are incapable of feeding themselves. So the soldiers basically perform two jobs. When enemies attack the colony, and it's probably mainly vertebrate enemies that they're responding to, the soldiers bite and sting enemies. they don't perform any of these other tasks that I just mentioned. And so what this means is that the soldiers have a relatively very simple behavioral repertoire. They're playing a very specialized but reduced behavioral role in the colony. Now, I'd like to kind of step aside for a moment, and I was so excited. I relatively recently finally got around to reading Walden by Henry David Thoreau. This was a very important early piece of natural history writing and philosophizing in the United States. And in Walden, Thoreau has this really interesting passage on human self-sufficiency that I think perhaps speaks to what we're going to look at and talk about in terms of division of labor in army ant society. So of course, Thoreau is talking about humans. So he says, it is not the tailor alone who is the ninth part of a man. It is as much the preacher and the merchant and the farmer. Where is this division of labor to end? No doubt another man may also think for me, but it is not therefore desirable that he should do so to the exclusion of my thinking for myself. And so the message here is, right, this is Thoreau kind of arguing in favor of individual cognitive ability, individual cognitive incentive, and implying perhaps that there is a danger to the human condition of subverting one's cognitive abilities to other individuals. And I think that's an interesting viewpoint, and we'll come back to this. Okay, let's look at that idea as applied to army ants and other insects. So the question that we're going to address is, how do body size and behavior relate to brain size and brain architecture? So what my lab does, a lot of the data that you're going to see throughout this talk, we do histology, we do serial thin sections, and use that to explore the volumes of brains compared to body size, as well as the relative sizes of different brain regions. And by the way, in this pair of micrographs of histological sections, these are a small-bodied worker and a large-bodied worker. These are nestmates from an army ant colony, and they are scaled to match each other in magnification. So you get a sense of the range of body sizes or head capsule sizes, and perhaps some sense of the relatively small differences in brain volume that goes along with this massive change in body size. So we use these thin sections to reconstruct brain volumes and brain region volumes. And the regions of the brain that I'd like to draw your attention to in particular, and we'll come back to these other times later in the talk. Up here on the top of the brain in dark blue is the mushroom body calyx. This is a central processing region that is heavily involved in lots of complex cognitive capacities, including learning and memory. And then here is the central brain mass. We're going to use this as an index of overall brain size. And then down here in the aquamarine or light blue color are the antennal lobes. These are involved very heavily in chemosensation. So what we did was compare the sizes of the brains of workers and soldiers across 8 different species of army ants from the genus Eceton. And what we're doing here is plotting relative brain volume, so this is brain over head capsule volume, against head capsule volume. And what we see is a really nice illustration of what's referred to as Haller's rule. And this is a commonly observed pattern. We're going to come back to Haller's rule later. So basically, if we look at the smallest bodied workers, the brains fill over 25% of their total head volume. Whereas in the case of the soldiers out here, brains fill something on the order of 1 to 2% of head volume. So what this suggests is that as you go down in body size, the relative size of the brain increases, and it increases very, very dramatically at the low end. So it almost kind of looks like you're hitting a wall, right? An absolute limit on minimum brain size. And that's one interpretation of what Haller's rule tells us about brain investment. We also find if we just do this is not relative brain size, now this is absolute brain size. If we do a plot, a log-log plot of brain size against head size, what we see is that the soldiers, colored in the blue points here with the red regression line, are smaller. Soldiers' brains are smaller for their body size than the brains of the workers. So their overall investment, soldiers' overall investment in brain tissue is lower. And there are also differences in brain structure investment as well. And so if we look at this top series, there's a pair of bars for each species, each of the 8 species, same thing down at the bottom here. The soldiers are represented in blue, the other workers are represented in gray. In all species, the soldiers' relative investment in their mushroom body calyx was lower than it was for the rest of the workers, and the same thing applies to the antennal lobes. So not only do soldiers have relatively small brains, they invest relatively less in these functionally important brain regions, learning and memory, and chemosensory processing. So that suggests a simplified cognitive capacity to the extent that cognitive capacity is reflected in brain region size. So Esteton soldiers have relatively simplified behavior, and they apparently have simplified brains to go along with that. And what I want to point out, this is really important, even though we replicated this, I think one of the things that made this study very exciting was we actually sampled pretty well across that entire genus. We got 8 of the, if I remember correctly, there was something like 10 or 12 known species. We got 8 of them sampled, and the results were very consistent. But the point of this is the brain differences between the soldiers and the workers of their own species result from developmental plasticity. And there are weak or no genetic effects. So that is a response to experience during immature larval development that drives these differences in brain architecture. So again, let's keep Thoreau's admonition about handing off your cognitive abilities to your group mates in mind. Neuroecology also makes evolutionary predictions, and we can address these by making comparisons among species. So we also expect species brain investment patterns to match the cognitive demands that that species confronts. And we also then might predict that evolutionary changes in species ecology will be associated with changes in brain structure. And a classic example of this comes from the evolution of cave-dwelling fish. Classically, neuroecology makes use of changes in the sensory environment that animals occupy. And here we have ancestral fish populations living on the surface in streams, having repeatedly invaded these dark cave environments. And consistently across multiple evolutionary transitions in these fish, we see changes in brain architecture that match the changes in the sensory environment. So, what we see here is a massive decrease in the visual processing system and massive increases in the regions of the brain that are involved in sampling the sensory environment related to touch and body position and such. But the social brain hypothesis suggests to us that the social environment of animals is also a relevant feature of their ecology. So going beyond shifts in sensory environments, can we talk about how changes in the social environment might be associated with changes in brain evolution? So the social brain hypothesis posits that sociality places cognitive demands on individuals. The original framing of the social brain hypothesis predicted that basically, in a nutshell, this is simplifying a little bit, but that we expect more sociality to be associated with greater brain investment. And as predicted, this hypothesis has now been tested in many different lineages of vertebrates, and we find that it is often the case that increases in sociality are associated with increases in brain tissue investment. So evidence in support of this idea has been found in a number of different groups of mammals, including primates, in some social birds, and even, interestingly, in social fish. So I decided to take advantage of my lab's interest in doing comparative analyses across different levels of social complexity in social insects, and we use paper wasps in the family Vespidae as models for this. And one of the reasons that I think these wasps, the Vespids, are great models is because they offer us in a single family a very wide array, a very great diversity of social structures. So the Vespidae include solitary nesting species, the potter wasps, species that have relatively small and relatively simple societies, like these independent founding Miscasiderus wasps here. And this same family also has given rise to several different times very large colony swarm founding species. And so you have this range of social complexity that almost spans the known range of social complexity of animal life on Earth. Certainly, obviously, by definition at the low end, if you've got solitary living individuals, that's as simple as you can get. These large, complex societies of paper wasps come at least close to rivaling some of the most complex societies that we know among social insects. But what is the proper social brain's prediction for insects? So here's the common vertebrate pattern. So what I'd like you all to do as viewers is I'm going to show you at least that not obviously the full range of possible predictions, but a sampling of possible predictions. I'd like you to personally note down which one you believe is likely to be correct, and we'll look at the results of that on the next slide. So this is the common vertebrate pattern that we would expect, that as we see increases in social complexity, there should be an increase in some measure of brain investment. This is an alternative possibility. Perhaps brain investment goes up as you get to simple societies, and then it goes back down again as you achieve complex societies like army ants. Or could it look more like this, where there's actually a decrease in brain investment as social complexity increases? So just take a moment to think this through and kind of make your guess as to which one is likely to be correct in social insects. What I'm going to suggest is that this says something about you. So if you predict that they follow the vertebrate pattern, I'm going to tag you as an optimist or a Pollyanna. If you chose the middle scenario, I'm going to tag you as a non-committal person. And if you chose the final scenario, you're a curmudgeon. But interestingly enough, the curmudgeons win. Okay, so again, we are going to take histological sections and reconstruct brain volumes and brain region volumes of paper wasps from species with a wide range of different body sizes and also, of course, a wide range of social complexities. And in this case, we're going to focus in very heavily on the mushroom bodies, that region that we already talked about for the army ants. These are these very dorsal / anterior higher order integration, learning, and memory centers of the brain. And we're going to look at relative mushroom body investment. So what we're plotting here is one measure of social complexity, which is colony size on a log scale, against the species mean relative investment in mushroom bodies. And what we see is that the solitary species have higher mushroom body investment, relative mushroom body investment, than any of the social species. And that going from simple societies to complex societies does not seem to entail very much further directional change. So mushroom body investment declines with sociality. And this is in many senses the opposite pattern, the opposite direction from the vertebrate social brain effect. And in fact, the curmudgeons perhaps were somewhat optimistic, right? So it looks like really what's happening here, I would argue, is the data suggests that the transition from solitary to social was key. In other words, you get a drop off in mushroom body investment once you make that change from solitary living to even relatively simple, small societies. Why the difference? Why are the paper wasps so different from most vertebrate taxa that have been looked at? Well, one possibility is we're looking at the effects of distributed cognition. One way we can think about an individual's role in an insect colony is that the cognitive demands on an individual are reduced when you have a coordinated cooperative group like most insect colonies. So in some senses, cognition can be offloaded or shared among the colony members. Perhaps the fact that increases in group size and other measures of social complexity among vertebrates being associated with increased brain investment is really a response to within group conflict. And we might wonder if that isn't part of what we're seeing in the human condition, because as we're all probably aware from family gatherings, there can be plenty of within group conflict in humans as well. And I just want to note also a very exciting data that came out soon after we did our paper wasp analysis. A comparative study was done on African mole rats, again, very similar design, comparing solitary species to social species with different group sizes. And the mole rat data suggested that the overall evolutionary pattern was similar to that we found in paper wasps. And this may be the exception that proves the rule, because mole rat societies are structured and developed very much like paper wasp societies. They are large families of cooperating sterile offspring that are headed by a reproductive pair. And that is unusual among vertebrates, but again, maps very closely to the ways that insect societies are structured. I also want to note that there is some evidence for brain size decline relatively recently in modern humans. And it's important to note that this is not associated with a change in average body size. And the pattern is also stronger, although it's apparently present in female humans and women, the pattern is stronger in men. And so over about the last 20,000 years, casts of skulls using that to estimate brain architecture suggests that the human brain has lost, particularly males, have lost about the equivalent of a tennis ball's worth of volume in about the last 20,000 years. And this is all happening in modern humans. So this could possibly represent reduced male competition over this time. The explanation that I find most intriguing is the possibility that this reflects something like what we see possibly happening in social insects, that there's been cognitive offloading to language and more recently possibly to technology. So here we have the smartphone leading to the stupid human. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but again, we come back to Thoreau's admonitions about the dangers of handing off your cognitive work to other individuals. And that may be part of exactly what humans have been doing in recent times. Okay, so now we'd like to move off to our most recent work on paper wasp brain investment and talk to you a bit about body size allometry. And this is taking advantage of the fact that paper wasps, in addition to their range of social complexities, also offer a very wide range of body sizes. So here are two of our subject species, pin specimens here, workers side by side. You can see that there is a very dramatic range of body sizes available in this group. So if we look across our range of subjects, here is a section taken at roughly the same location in the brain. In these two different species, this is a Vespa hornet and one of our smaller bodied species down at the bottom here, a Lipomeles paper wasp. And this is represents about a 29-fold total brain volume difference. So I've gotten really interested in the relationship between body size and brain structure. And we started off using head capsule volume as our index of body size because we felt that the head capsule was most directly relevant to the brain, which is housed inside the head capsule. We're going to revisit this decision a bit later. So we did a comparative analysis. We sampled species from a wide range of different genera. And this diagram is just showing, this is a relatively recent phylogeny of the paper wasp genera and species that we sampled. And then the sizes of the blue dots up above the species or genus names represent the relative body size of the species that we sampled. And what you can see here is that size is not strongly related to species relatedness. In other words, there's a lot of evolutionary flexibility apparently in body size across this tree. And that's a good feature because it allows us potentially to separate the effects of relatedness or phylogeny from the effects of body size. And that's exactly what we did statistically. So what we find is that, perhaps not surprisingly, in fact, we might be alarmed if this were not the case, total brain volume does increase with body size in an absolute sense. But again, illustrating Haller's rule, it does so at a strongly decelerating rate. So again, this bottom plot here is relative brain volume. So that's brain size relative to body size, in this case, relative to head capsule size, plotted against body size. And what we see is this, again, this indication of, basically hitting a wall right at the low end, where there seems to be a limit on further decreases in brain size, even as body size evolves to be smaller and smaller. So just to illustrate Haller's rule, what I'm showing here is, this is on the right, a large-bodied species, but I've kind of scaled it down to match the absolute size of this smaller-bodied species over on the left. If I kind of color in the brain regions, what you can see is the tiny species have stuffed heads, and the larger species are effectively airheads. So again, the relative amount of volume in the body that's occupied by the brain is much, much higher for the smaller species. But total brain volume was not the whole story. There was also significant brain region allometry across the range of body sizes that we sampled. And I think this is a really interesting issue. I'm very excited about the possibility of following up on this finding. What we find is that the relative volume, the relative size of the mushroom bodies declined sharply at the smallest body sizes. Now, we don't know whether that is associated with or implies cognitive deficits in the small species, but it certainly raises that as an interesting prediction. And this decrease in relative mushroom body volume with body size happens even though relative brain size, of course, as we just looked at, is increasing at small body sizes. So it suggests that there's something putting very strong brakes on the amount of investment in the mushroom bodies as the brain and as the body gets smaller and smaller. I also, as a general conclusion, again, it's really important, I believe, to take body size into account when analyzing the functional significance of brain structures and brain structure evolution. And Haller's rule is, I think, fascinating. It's observed again and again in different lineages of animals, very commonly observed pattern, but it's not terribly well explained. But what I got really interested in, based on this finding, was that Haller's rule might have some interesting implications for lower limits on body size evolution. So I recall this data set, reverse neuroecology. So the idea here is we're going to look at the possibility that the brain is affecting body size evolution somehow. And I think that our data suggests the possibility that brain-body allometry is an important but overlooked factor in the evolutionary ecology of animal body size and shape. So what we did was, now we're not going to look at brains, we're actually going to look at body parts, basically. We're going to look at the relationships between head capsules and bodies. So we did this so far on 29 different species. We're interested in expanding this data set. It's 29 different species of paper wasps. And here's what we find. Small wasps have relatively large heads. So there's the regression line, and this turns out to be significant even after accounting for the effects of phylogeny. So if we look at the small species, their heads make up about 30% of total body weight. At the high end, the large species that we studied, heads are less than 10% of total body weight. So you get this dramatic change in shape where the small species are basically big-headed. And I suggest that one factor that may drive this is that the need to accommodate brains may be driving body shape evolution. In other words, big-headedness in small species. So that's where this cartoon comes back in. And brains may be placing, in an absolute sense, a lower limit on body size in a given lineage of animals. What does this mean in terms of understanding body structure? Well, I would argue that large-headed bodies may challenge animals' biomechanics. And this may apply to all species, right? If you're front loaded, if you're big headed, that's going to change how your body functions and how it operates. I think that this is likely to be especially relevant to flying animals. And then other interesting questions, and these are just possibilities. We haven't explored this yet, but I wonder whether small species heads have to be modified to house their relatively large brains. And again, remember our little lipomeles here, where its head capsule is to a large extent crammed with its brain tissue. So one possibility is that the cuticle, right, the exoskeleton of the head capsule is thinner or weaker. There may also be reduced muscle mass inside the head capsule to accommodate this large brain. And if those kinds of things are happening, they may have biomechanical implications for the ecology and behavior of these wasps. For example, if you have reduced muscle mass, that may affect the kinds of prey that you're capable of capturing or processing. It may affect your ability to collect and process nest building materials. And I just want to note that some of the very small paper wasps, like these lipomeles, use plant fibers rather than wood pulp to build their nests. Okay, so that's all I have to say. I think I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So I don't know how you're doing it. Are you taking them in the chat and then passing them on to me?
Yes,
Okay.
Professor Sean. Thank you so much for your talk. It was so intriguing, like starting from wasps, ants, and human beings. Well, yeah, we'll proceed towards the questions now. Firstly, I have a personal question myself. I wanted to ask, like, what are, if there are any, like, other reasons of decrease in brain size, during all the evolution? Because technology, it's like very recent. What are other reasons? Like maybe it could be environmental conditions, or like maybe any other reasons. Like, if you could enlighten me on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think you can posit all kinds of changes and factors that might be associated with relative decrease in brain investment. I think you could imagine, for example, shifts in nutrition and nutritional ecology could be playing a role. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure that you would necessarily make a prediction of decreased brain investment. But I think that's certainly plausible. I find it intriguing to think about, again, the smartphone, right, that I put in there, obviously, that kind of technological innovation, writing, those are very, very recent. Don't go and, come anywhere near giving us 20,000 years of effect. But we've been sharing information, certainly, potentially at least in oral traditions, for about that long. And so even the ability to hand off information and rely on oral sharing of information could conceivably affect individual cognitive ability by decreasing it, right? Basically the argument here is that to the extent that you can rely on other individuals, if your fitness is not going to crash because you made a cognitive mistake because someone else is there to watch your back, that may select for decreased investment in cognitive ability and could conceivably be affected in decreased brain tissue investment as well. So, that's the possibility that I find really intriguing. What I like about that idea is that it moves us away from being obsessed with humans' massive investment in brains, and particularly in forebrains, right? And how unbelievable we are in terms of massive brain investment. And yet here's this suggestion that as we've become more social potentially, right, and more cooperative and relied on each other, that has relaxed the need to rely on ourselves. And again, going back to Thoreau, is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, certainly here in the United States, I would argue that we culturally have almost an overblown obsession with individual capacity and individual incentive. And, though that is in tension with cooperation and community-oriented activity. And I think we need to question whether that is really, the best pathway forward for humans. And I think it's intriguing that decrease in brain investment, at least is consistent with that idea. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like, I really did got an insight into that. Well, I would like Savikrut Pai to, if you want to ask a question live. Svikrut? Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Svikrut,
I'm
go
on.
ahead.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, shall I go ahead first, Shreesh? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
That's fine.
yes.
So thanks so much for the talk, Professor O'Donnell. I really enjoyed it. And actually, this is something I've been super interested in as well, because for my master's thesis, there was a particular part, especially the introductory part, which focused a lot on looking at how much, brain size and brain processing power kind of varies, and even across species. And, there's this one particular thing, right? And this is kind of related to what you showed us in the slides regarding human brain volume potentially having reduced over, of course, over several thousand years. But like, it is a potential possibility that we're heading in that direction. But like, how good is volume an indicator of brain processing power, or for that matter, this really convoluted topic called intelligence? Because I mean, so much that goes into it, and I mean, right? If you think about it that way, then there's this entirely new. I think metric called not entirely new, but there's this metric called encephalization quotient, which I came across, which talks
Yes.
about this thing. And yeah, I'll let you go ahead and answer me on this one, because it's
Yeah, I
cool.
mean, no, it's an important question, right? So you certainly can get shifts. I would argue that looking at region volumes and total brain volume, especially, right? I think we need to be very careful about that. Although I do think it can tell us some interesting things. But how do you translate that into cognitive capacity, right? And there's no question that we have examples of systems and behaviors where changes in cognitive ability are not well reflected, for example, in volumetric changes. And so there are a couple of things that I would say in response to that. One is, again, I think it's very important to keep in mind that it's extremely unlikely that changes in brain, measurable changes in brain volume, are not going to have developmental implications and cost benefit implications for the animals that that experience them, and that's particularly true over evolutionary time. So I think there's good reason to expect that changes in volume are going to tell us something about investment. So then the question becomes, well, okay, what's the cognitive payoff? We have evidence in paper wasps it's quite unlikely, although we haven't actually gone in and tested this ourselves in our own system, but based on what we know in other insects, it's pretty unlikely that we're looking at neurogenesis. There's certainly potential for brain cell death and pruning to be happening in the adult stage in insects. Neurogenesis, recruitment of new neurons, is unlikely to be part of what we're looking at. Certainly at the individual level, right, at the plasticity level. Again, that could conceivably be part of the story across species. There's no question about that. What we do have evidence for at the individual level, at the plasticity level, is that changes in key neurons, and these are the intrinsic nerve cells that make up the mushroom bodies, in terms of their connectivity, basically. So their dendritic complexity, both volume and length, increases in ways that match the volume changes that we've seen. And so we think that probably, at least in adult social insects, in these plasticity studies, that a lot of really what we're looking at are changes in the neurons that are already present, rather than recruitment of new neurons. In other words, you're not changing unit number, you're changing unit connectivity. And then there's a really intriguing study, one of the few that I can think of, that actually directly addresses this question of the relationship of brain size and cognitive ability. That was an artificial selection study that was done on guppies fairly recently. And what the researchers found was they went in and selected for brain size, relative brain size. So they didn't even focus in on particular brain regions. So in some senses, right, it was relatively crude. They selected on relative brain size in guppies. And what they found was a follow-on effect on cognitive ability. So the lines that had increased brains, that were selected for increased brain size, also had enhanced problem-solving abilities. One of the things that was interesting about that, by the way, was that the particular cognitive capacities that were enhanced differed between males and females, even though the selection pressure was the same. In other words, again, just using brain size, right, as the metric for deciding who got to breed. So that is one of the few studies that directly addresses this issue, that you get changes in cognitive ability with changes in brain investment, in this case, size.
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. Shresht, would you like to ask your question live?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Professor O'Donnell. That was a very great talk. I think you've answered this question in the previous question, but the question I had is, what could be the evolutionary pressure of having a lower brain size to body size ratio in the case of soldier ants specifically? And
Oh,
is it perhaps because of the energy consideration, or
you know what?
something?
Thank you so much for asking that. It's a great question, and I wish I had touched on that when I was presenting those data. Yes, that I think is one of the things that makes that system so exciting, because the argument is, right? I mean, presumably that presents challenges to the individual soldier. What we think is that the advantage, the payoff, accrues at the colony level, exactly as you said. So it's probably an energy saving in the end. No, we don't really know necessarily that energy is the only currency that's important, and that's an important point to keep in mind. But let's just posit that it's energy. The energy savings accrues at the colony level. So they are investing less in the brain tissue of soldiers because they can get away with doing that, because the soldiers are relatively simple in their behavior. But that only really makes sense in the context of the society. So when you're dividing up behavior and dividing up labor among individuals, you can get away with those individual units, those individual animals, right, the workers, having reduced cognitive capacity because they are in this social framework that allows their limited cognitive capacity not to come at a terrible cost. So in other words, if a soldier army ant were to try to go off and make it on her own in the big world, our guess would be that she would be, do an absolutely terrible job of doing that. Army ants only function cognitively and behaviorally in the context of the social group. And so the costs and benefits of brain investment also then must be occurring at the level of the social group. Yes, so again, thank you for asking that. It's a really important point.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shresht, for your question. And I would like to thank Dr. Sean for such a wonderful talk. And it was so intriguing. And thank you so much for joining with us here today. I would like to hand over the session to Pranjal Garg, who is founder and president of Project Encephalon.
Hi, so I am Pranjal, and thank you, Dr. Sean, for very exciting talk. So at the end of each talk, I tend to acknowledge some members of my team without whom organizing Cajal Week would have been impossible. Today, I'm acknowledging the work of Amartya, Aishwarya, Anushri, and Sachin for providing extraordinary support during the event. Next talk will start in approximately 1 or 2 minutes. The link for the talk can be found on social media webpage, and it has been posted here also. So please join there, everyone. Thank you so much. See you in Dr. Lisa's talk. Thank you, Dr. Sean. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you.
Great, thank you.